real quickly, if you would, if everyone would please, I have a couple of requests. Number one, please take out your phones and please turn them on. Okay? And then if you tweet, if you use Twitter, then the hashtag is Original Green, and I'll tell you why in a moment, and I'm just simply @Steve_Mouzon. Now, if you forget any of that, then down here at the bottom is the hashtag, and there's my username. Because here's the thing, there's going to be, the reason I'm putting all this on here, one of the big reasons is the fact that this is going to be a complete flood of information. You cannot possibly remember everything I'm going to say in the next 45 minutes because it's like 190 slides. So anyhow, listen. Yeah, no kidding. So if you want to look some of it up, you can go there. You say, why Original Green? Well, I wrote a book a few years ago called The Original Green, and basically it says, well, hey, let's find out what worked for humanity for almost all of human history and see if we might learn some things today that might work for us again. So a lot of the things I'm going to tell you about are things that actually once worked really well for a long time and that we've forgotten now, but that's what actually makes the small-scale infill work. Now, for a while, from some of the things I'm going to tell you, you're going to think I'm a space alien or something, but just bear with me because there's some really useful stuff in here that you need to hear about. So the big key is what we're talking about, if you're looking at doing infill, is a complete paradigm change on the scales of what we're talking about. We're going to look at those different measures and then some general mechanisms for making this work, and then we'll look at some parts that you might actually fill in, some particulars of making it work as well. The problem that we have right now is the scale of the developers. It's almost as big of a difference between what used to work in the past and what's going to work in this new setting. It's about as big of a difference as those guys. Okay, so it really is, it's a fundamental difference. I'm not saying that a big developer can't possibly make it work at a small infill scale. I'm just saying that everything that worked for them in their minds of their whole system in the past will not work in this setting. Okay, so if they keep trying to do things the way they did do them when they were taking down thousands of acres at a time, it won't work. But if they completely change the way of thinking, it can work very well. And in reality, it's how America was built. So let's take a look at what we're looking at today. This is Portland, and it's what I would call an unfinished city because there's some buildings there. But as you look at the city, you're actually seeing more parking lots, more cavities, if you will, in the street than what you're seeing substance. Now, here's a case just right around the corner here of a finished highway. I mean, this is a super highway in a very unfinished town. The same problems are here. As you look around, there's almost more cavities than there are substance in most places here in town as well. And so here's the finished condition. When you get every street in the town center to this condition, or to this condition, then you can consider yourself having finished. But now, an interesting thing about that as well, actually we'll look at that in just a second, but before we do, you say, wait a minute now, Steve, you're talking about taking out all that parking? That's impossible to make that work. You cannot take out all those parking spaces and put buildings in their place and expect for anything to work. Well, you're right, it won't in the context of the way we do things today, but there are a few little tricks we'll talk about. For example, you can do a lot of parking in the center of the block that will feed what's on the face of the block, so it doesn't have to all be these huge just bays of parking that we're used to seeing. Let's think too about what the recent system of building big stuff that we've had since the end of World War II in particular, although it was growing before that, what it produces. At its best, in the old buildings, there were some old big buildings as well, but at its best, the old stuff that was big and contextual was no better than this. This is the best you could get. And that's really a pretty good building. It's kind of like some of these here that we're in. Okay? Now the new ones that are big and new and contextual, that's about the best you're going to get. Okay? And, it just simply is, it's okay, but it's not nearly so interesting as those finished images I was showing you just a moment ago of the smaller scale stuff. Now, if you get something this big, and new and non-contextual, you know, then it goes even further downhill. Most people would agree that this is not what they would call a lovable building. And so if you think about the old economic drivers, what they were things like ports and iron ore or some other kind of a natural resource or whatever. Now today, the new economic driver is the cool factor. What is the cool factor of a place or of a street or of even a section of a street, you know, just a block? What's the cool factor there? And that's what actually drives the creatives to decide whether they want to show up, and most of us are. You know, most people fit in that category today. We don't have that many folks that are working in the factories anymore. So consider this. I have a theory that the coolest retail in town, if you ask people, if you take a poll in any town, in almost every case they'll say, well, it'll happen to be a shop that is in a fairly narrow bay. The narrower the bay, the more likely it is to be cool. I'll absolutely guarantee that Walmart is never the coolest retail in town. You know, it's 400 feet wide, or however wide Walmart buildings are. They just aren't. It's impossible. But the narrower you get, then the cooler it can be. Now, part of the reason for that is the fact that if you, when it is a narrow bay, you're changing the view every few steps. You know, like if I can go, if I'm here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 steps or whatever, and I change my view to another storefront, that's far more interesting than if I have to walk 30 seconds. And the more you entertain the people that are walking, the more they want to walk there. So let's look too at what happens when you're talking about the stuff that the big developers haven't been doing. Not to say that they can't, but that they haven't been doing, but it's natural for the small developers. In the new reality of building today, this is 3 projects. There's one here, there's one there, and there's one there. 3 totally separate projects. And here's the interesting thing. Part of what happens when you download to smaller parcels is that it just naturally becomes more interesting because everyone is going to take a slightly different approach. Another thing that happens when you deal in small increments, you know, if you're dealing with topography, no big deal. They step downhill beautifully. If you try doing a big building there, that's not the same thing. It can also change generationally over time. This is probably a 2nd generation building here. This may be a 3rd generation building here, and yet they can sit nicely side by side so the street can mature over time. This might even be 3 generations. I don't know, the wood building in the middle, and this one and that one. I actually don't know. It could be 2, could be 3. And then if you also think about what the back alleys can do in the parts of urbanism where you have it, that if you have the back alleys, then you actually, that's a whole other frontage that you have, so there can be shops in the back, shops in the front, again, to make it a more interesting thing. Another thing we heard today, one of the speakers, I forget who it was, talking about planning for the unplanned. Maybe it's George, but anyhow, if you prepare for an unpredictable mix of uses, you know, where you don't say it'll be this and this and this, you know, those hilarious list of uses that we saw. Here's live music and entertainment, and then here's fine food and spirits and sodas. Maybe those 2 go together, I don't know. But over here's bathtubs, laboratories, and water closets, you know, in the same building. Let that stuff happen. That's far more interesting than if it's all exactly the same thing. Also make sure that you have places where people can actually do work. You know, this is an actual working dock down in Portland, just behind the front street, whatever it's called. Let's talk about parking as well. And now, I could point you to Manhattan and say, look at Manhattan, there's no parking spaces hardly. But nothing's like Manhattan. Well, let me tell you something a whole lot different. I come, as I said before, from Miami Beach. I live in the dead center of South Beach. Now, if you look at just South Beach, that's roughly 39,000 people, of which about 45% of them don't even own a car. Okay? Now, you say, okay, well, that's 20,000 cars or whatever, almost. No, it actually isn't. In the U.S. today, there's about 4.5 parking spaces for every car in America. Okay, so if you apply that multiple, then you're saying that essentially what it amounts to, if you make a place, this is a small town of 39,000 people. Okay, I mean, it's not Manhattan. If you make a place that almost half the people don't need a car, then that's like 79,000 parking spaces that you don't need, roughly. And so anyhow, it makes a massive difference for every person that doesn't need to drive. Because of the fact that they can walk to everything, it makes a massive difference in actually what you can do. I have framed the rest of this is part of something that I call a 12-step program of sprawl recovery. Sprawl has been a great addiction to America since the end of World War II for all the reasons that Chuck was talking about earlier in the day. And so this is a step program for recovering from that. Now, whether your community has sprawl or whether it simply is trying to say, well, what should we do with all of these missed opportunities and all these cavities in the streetscape? Actually, what we find is that a lot of the systems that we as new urbanists come up with, because of the fact that we're generalists, it may have been meant for one thing like sprawl, but it might also work equally well in something like disinvested cities. And so we tend to not have single-use tools, but multi-use tools. And so this is an example of that. So whether your context is a sprawling city or one that has a lot of disinvestment, the things I'm going to talk about work equally well. There's been people that have been working for a number of years. I'm one of quite a number that have been working to try to figure out what do we do about sprawl. There's one thing that I should note, if you're from a disinvested city background, this is Vicksburg, Mississippi, which actually looks a whole lot like things that we see walking around on the streets out here in terms of the level of investment. And what we found is that there were these little patches of red that were just slight, you might say it was just a remnant of what used to be a neighborhood center. And so if you go and look for just those tiny little pieces of remnants of what was once there, and then begin to stitch things together around that, then that really is a starting point. I want to talk about 3 game changers of sprawl recovery. These are 3 sets of principles. These are 3 things that you may, this is where you're going to start saying the guy is a space alien, okay? But bear with me because this stuff actually makes a lot of sense. There's a system called the transect. It's something that we've been working with as urbanists for about a decade now. People in the biological fields have known about this system is a system of managing the natural environment for more like 100 years. But basically the idea is that you can put everything in order from T1, which is natural or the wilderness, all the way to T6, which is the urban core. Not every city has T6, but everybody's got a main street, which is T5, and then there's the general urban neighborhoods, the suburban, which is outskirts, and T2 rural, which is fields and meadows. I'll talk more about this in a minute. There's another idea that I talked some about last night. Let me kind of fill in a couple of blanks here for most of y'all that weren't at the event last night. It's a set of ideas that I call walk appeal, and basically the notion of that is that for about 100 years now, we've had this diagram which has shown the quarter-mile radius, or the 5-minute walk, and the presumption is that that's as far as people will walk until they want to get in the car and drive. And that is the case in some settings, okay, but it's not the case in every setting. For example, if you're in a power center, like here's the quarter-mile radius, this line, but you might only walk 100 feet. Or something like that there because the walk is so dreadful. Over here, this is Rome turned sideways. This is Piazza di Popolo. That's the Vittorio Emanuele. Here's the quarter-mile radius here. These are the same scale. But you will gladly walk from the Piazza to the Vittorio, and then keep on walking possibly for miles further. Now, it's not because you've suddenly become a Roman. No, you're still an American, maybe from Dallas or wherever, it doesn't matter. You know, people say nobody ever walks in Dallas, but you put the same person in a different setting and they will behave differently. And so there's some things that we can measure about walk appeal. For example, how often, as you saw me pacing off there a minute ago, how often do you change the view? By just simply having this garden room out here in these piers every couple of paces, that changes the view itself. And so the quicker you change the view, the more interesting it is to people walking by. Street enclosure. This is one of the few streets in America. This is 14th Street in D.C. That has a greater than a 1-to-1 enclosure. And great streets all over Europe have that. Now, what happens is if you have a narrow street, you can get by with less height because you have less width. This is in North Adams, Massachusetts. There's also another thing that we know has a good effect is the window of view and also the shelter with either an awning or a gallery. The window of view means this, that on a great main street you need to have about 70% glass at eye level as you walk by. And it really needs to be open from about 3 feet to about 8 feet so you can really see into the shop and the interesting things that are there. This is something that I call a goal in the middle distance. Like this is in Portland, and you see the tower there. If you have a place that is not so interesting, like this cavity over here in the streetscape, and that's still in the distance, and you'll keep walking towards that, even if the walk appeal of that one little stretch there isn't so good. If you can turn the corner well, like this street in Alexandria, this is the main street right here, and that's the side street. But if you can turn the corner well, that'll pull in people from the neighborhoods like this does not do. As you can see, the people there, that's a really boring walk to walk on. And so some of the immeasurables are how many people are on the streets. I mean, we're all drawn to other humans. And also, like in sprawl, we all know sprawl like the back of our hands. There's no mysteries in sprawl. But if you're in a great city that has what we call magic, that the magic of the city is that you might turn a corner and find something that you never would have anticipated. And also, here's another thing. If you get walk appeal really, really awesome, then it actually is great traffic calming. This guy has actually stopped talking to that guy on the street. This is on Ocean Drive. We're actually crawling by so slowly that it might as well be stopped. But nobody's complaining. Nobody's blowing their horns. It's such an interesting scene that everybody is well entertained. So the standard is this. I call it the London standard. It could be Paris or Rome or wherever. I just happen to be presenting this in London for the first time. And basically that is, on the greatest streets in the world, we'll easily walk 2 miles without even thinking about driving. A great main street will easily walk 3/4 of a mile without thinking about it. Now this is where the quarter-mile radius actually works, in a good neighborhood street. Now we have a lot of those in great traditional neighborhoods, and maybe that's why that came to be the standard, but that's where people will actually walk that distance. If you get into the T3 of the suburban condition, where the houses are further back and further apart, it's not as interesting to walk about 1/10 of a mile there. If you get in a regular subdivision, maybe 250 feet, which explains why people in subdivisions know so few people that live closely around them. The power center we talked about, you might walk 100 feet. Actually, what you'll do is you'll walk to only the nearest parking space that is open. And if somebody's going to pull out, you wait 5 minutes for them to pull out, not because you're a lazy slob, but because it's such a dreadful walking experience that you can't bear to walk 3 spaces further. It just really is worth it to you to wait for them to pull out. At this worst of all conditions, an arterial here and parking there, I say 25 feet, but nobody walks there unless the car breaks down. Now, I want to give you something. Think of this. Every one of you sitting in the room, do a self-diagnosis. This is my diagnosis, okay? This is for me. I'm showing you what my condition is. Do it for yourself, and then I'm going to ask you a question when we get done. I call this the web of daily life. Until we moved our office home at the beginning of the year, our office was there and our home was here, just a few blocks away. And then here's the park, here's the post office, here's our doctor's office, the accountant's office. The bank is there, my vitamin store is there, the nearest grocery store to home is there, the nearest one to the office was there, the hardware store is there. Now that's far enough that we'll normally take a bike, but Wanda's bike has baskets and so it works out just fine. No big deal. The bookstore is there, the Apple store is there, and then these are a few of the hundreds of restaurants that are in the area shown in this map. I like to run. There's one 3-mile run. Here's another, and here's another. You put all these things together, and you get what I called a minute ago the web of daily life. Now, here's the question to ask yourself when you do your own web of daily life. Ask yourself, how many of these things, when gas goes to $10 a gallon, can I still afford to do? And then ask the same question for $20 a gallon. Okay, I'm old enough to remember, I was 13 when the first oil embargo happened in 73. And so I'm old enough to remember back when they had, before that, when they had what they called gas wars, which had a very different meaning now than it did then. And that's when the gas stations competed and prices would regularly get down to $29.9, sometimes down even as low as $19.9 if they were real competitive. So 20 cents a gallon. I've recently paid $5 a gallon on South Beach, so that's 25 times as much. Okay, just in my lifetime. So, so going from $5 a gallon to $20 a gallon is only 4 times as much. Okay, that's 1/6 of the increase, if I've got my math right, roughly, of what it has happened since I was 13 years old. So no shadow of a doubt it's going to get to that point. Just ask yourself, can I still afford to live the life I live when gas does get to $20 a gallon? Okay, this walk appeal thing, here's what it does. St. Charles, Missouri has a great Main Street. I picked out one random store on Main Street where the store is, and I said, okay, I'm going to take the walk appeal settings of what currently exists and see how far out could they draw customers who would walk to their store, and that's about how far. You see it, the yellows and the reds at the ends and places where bad conditions just kill the walk. You see here. Now, if they moved everything up to where it was one notch better on the spectrum, that's how many customers they could get. Let me suggest to you that walk appeal is the greatest single predictor of the success or the failure of a neighborhood business. There should be no greater aim of somebody interested in making a neighborhood business thrive than increasing the walk appeal of the streets around it. Okay, the third space alien thing I'm going to show you is something called the Sky Method. The Sky Method was something I developed several years ago. It is a very, very low cost development paradigm for raw land. Okay, but you'll see, if you can imagine several steps in, this actually works equally well for something that's further developed as well. The first step is just to take the blocks and to code the blocks. This is coded for T2. Remember I talked about the transect. This would be, T3 is the most this will ever be. T4 is the most that will ever be, and T5 is the most that will ever be. Okay, so that's the limits for what it can be, and because the transect is specific enough, you don't know what will be there precisely, but you know the character of what will be there, and so that's what makes it work. And so the whole idea is that you start out by buying, and I'm just going to keep flipping through here, but you end up buying, you could buy a block at a time if it's raw land, and the thing is, this was designed for the Florida Panhandle. There, a road in T2, just out in the countryside, was a sand road, so there's basically almost no infrastructure to go in at the beginning. And what happens after a while is that at some point in time, somebody's going to say, well, you know what, I want to upgrade. And so they say, okay, I want to upgrade from T2 to T3. They do that. When they upgrade, they pay an upgrade fee to the town or the developer, whoever the overseeing entity is. Part of that fee is profit, and another part of that fee is to upgrade the infrastructure. So at that point, they have to have a paved road that gets to this part. And then they can develop the land and sell off the lots. And so what this is doing also is it's making, because everyone, once you buy a piece of land, whatever land you have at that point in time, you become a partner in the development because you have financial incentive, as do all your neighbors around you. Instead of everybody being NIMBYs for the one developer, then everybody has a stake in the thing. And so it totally changes the dynamic of how that works. Another thing to think about as well is this, well, say as it moves forward. Let me see. Am I hitting the right button here? Let me try this, pull it out. If I can, see if that works. Try the other port. Here we go. Okay, cool. But anyhow, so as you move along in the development process, what happens is that, and I was designing these one building at a time, just as they would be developed. I was not trying to see ahead, so I had no idea what I was going to draw at this point, from the previous drawing before. And at some point in time, you finally begin to get some T5, and at the beginning, those are just very small little shops added onto the front of the houses. It's not what you would think of as a typical Main Street. It starts off very humbly, but at some point, the people that are own this piece of land, together, they say, you know what, we need to upgrade. The developer would say, we need to upgrade the road so we can pull more T5 in, and of course that's what they would do. Now you notice that what's happened here is this one guy sold off the lots on the back, but he said, you know what, I think I'm okay with my little mini farm that I have left. I'm going to leave it that way. So what do you do about that? Well, it's his land, okay? But eventually he dies. We all die. And so what happens is the kids will say, you know what, we have a lot of value sitting here. This thing is coded for T5. We're going to actually, it's of enough interest to us. We're going to even vacate part of the land in the front so we can get proper Main Street parking on. And so then we'll build a proper Main Street building, and so that's how you end up. Now, one thing I should note about this, I am not a good enough planner to design something that's organic from the beginning. And I tried to see the end from the beginning. Okay, I'm just not good enough. There are a few people on earth that are that good, but I'm not. But when you download this to a bunch of sequential little decisions made by regular people, you notice that actually some of the great, really almost all of the great towns on earth were just built by the townspeople. Even the best planners today can only do a moderately competent job of what the old folks could do just by nature. So let's get into now some of the particulars of what you need to do of these 12 steps that I talked about. Step number one is to get civic space. Now, it doesn't have to be an entire block of square like this. This plaza in Chicago is only 70 feet wide. I stepped it off. This square in Portland is only 80 feet from this side to the side over there. I stepped that off yesterday just as well. So these can be fairly small pieces of property. It could be simply one of those buildings that burned down and is now just a parking lot. It could be a plaza or a square, so it doesn't have to be enormously big. Number two is recovering the thoroughfares to a condition where they have good walkability. You know, most of our thoroughfares are really car damaged. They have a lot of front entry garages, which makes this a kind of a minefield for anybody walking down there hoping to not get backed over by somebody coming out of the driveway that's late for work. And so we have to do a lot of things to recover that from that damage. What we also need to do is make sure that everything about that recovery makes those thoroughfares multimodal. So you can get around in a lot of different ways, like in this case, walking and biking, you know, and of course cars as well. And then where we can insert alleys and rear lanes, then in fabric where it doesn't already exist, we should have incentives for that. For example, you should be able to say to people just take one block at a time. So, okay, for this block, you guys, if you want to give up 20 feet at the back of your lot, or really it could be less than that, quite frankly, but the whole right-of-way would be 20 feet, so it'd be like 10 feet either side. Then you will have by right the right to build a carriage house that you can then sell. Okay, so in other words, incentivize them enough that they would actually want to do that. Because guess what? If you don't do that, then all this mess, which is out on garbage day or recycling day or whatever, is going to be on the front street instead. Whereas we want those looking like this, not having all the messy stuff. Also, allow there to be fences that actually come out and reclaim those frontage gardens and decrease the perceived width of the street. Absolutely have as much on-street parking as you can possibly have. This old lady here would have to be completely insane to sit out there if these cars were actually zipping by at 30 or 40 miles an hour as opposed to sitting there parked. It is a parked car that makes the sidewalk cafe possible. Okay? It would be just not possible other than that. And again, as I showed you before, this is an example from Portland. One of the worst things you can do is have parking behind and fast traffic in front. People simply don't walk on sidewalks like that. You know, you really have to sit there a while and to catch somebody there. The only thing worse than that probably is a parking deck, because those things are kind of just foreboding monsters that are... But now here's the thing too, think about this. If you take just 12 feet, the front 12 feet, or even take an entire parking bay of 18 feet, whatever, as a liner building, then you get all the parking you want behind that, and the liner building is the front, as opposed to this dreadful monster. Walkability is an incredibly fragile thing, though, because if you kill it in one block, people simply won't walk from one place to another. So you really have to test every path. You know, you look at this poor fellow, this is the only person out on the streets of Dallas that day when it was over 100 degrees, and the only reason he's there is because his boss said, you got to take this to the office down the street, okay? Otherwise, he wouldn't even be there. And so here, there's a couple of street trees. Further on down, they're really inconsequential. The next step is to try to get as many accessory units into the units that already exist in the fabric. And this is really a job for small-time developers that are literally people doing one building at a time. But the more people you have here, then the more customers you have for the businesses that will follow in areas that actually, now I'm talking about the reverse, of what actually could work in a main street as well. But if you're trying to reclaim an area that is just sprawling subdivisions, then you've got to have more customers than what you currently have today. Here's some other types of units that we haven't thought about in recent years, but that we ought to. There's the rear of lot cottage that you actually get to from the front. Those can be very charming. For a long time, Americans rented out the upstairs and helped pay the mortgage. We ought to be able to do that again in towns all over. These are some incredibly charming rear lane cottages in Key West. You will have buildings that are 5 to 10 times as expensive out on the main street with these much less expensive cottages on the rear lanes. But again, that's some of the best parts of Key West. They do a similar version of that in London, which is called Mews, except just here they're attached. Originally, the horse was down below and the groom slept above, and now, of course, people inhabit the whole thing. Number 4 is to make sure that if at all possible, that every building should give some kind of a gift to the street. Because if you do, that makes the street a much more enticing and interesting place to walk down. And the gift of the street can be things that either will shelter people, like an awning. It could refresh people. The classic example is the sidewalk cafe, as you see here. But it could be something as simple as a street fountain. It can delight people like this wonderful frontage garden. It can direct them like the tower in the distance. It can entertain them like a great storefront. It can inform them like a clock or sundial. It can help them remember like this memorial, or it can simply give them a place to rest. Now, as you see, Wanda here is not actually even sitting on a bench, but that's a bollard that is actually shaped in such a way that you can kind of lean back against it and rest there. So it doesn't just have to be park benches. That's not the only way of giving people a place to rest. Number 5 is to begin to allow edible gardens again, but this is a two-way street. The problem with edible gardens today is the fact that most people consider a vegetable garden to be no more lovable a thing than a utility room. Okay, it's just there to do a job, and that's it, and that's all it does. In reality, it can be a highly lovable thing. There's no reason that an edible garden shouldn't be every bit as lovable and beautiful as an ornamental garden. You know, we just simply need to design them. Nobody's designing them. Just I'll have some beans over here, some corn over there, and some cabbage there or whatever. And that's all the thought that goes in to a typical garden today. So if the people will agree to plant lovable gardens, then by all means you ought to be able to have them anywhere, even in the front yard. Okay, this is the front yard of some buildings in England. You ought to be able to have a garden in the front yard that is edible, so long as it agrees to be lovable as well. And then, of course, not everybody's going to want to raise vegetables, and so, of course, every neighborhood ought to have a farmer's market where you can find local produce. At this point in time, then this is actually the point where even in undifferentiated sprawl subdivisions, you can begin to start seeding some things that are actual businesses, and the first thing to go in would be a place to eat, because generally a lot of restaurants and bars and so forth are as much risk oblivious as any business type out there, and so that ought to be the first step. There's a lot of ways of doing this. The simplest is a food cart. We all know about them. Actually, this is not so much a cart, but this one kind of took a permanent residence here. It doesn't travel. And then the next step up from that is a food shack, which is literally just a shanty that's put up with the most ephemeral type construction. The next one would be what I call a food cottage, a little more proper building that you actually close up, and on a hot day you could cut on an air conditioner if you wanted to. So it's not just an open air shack. And then you move up to the third places, and of course I assume everybody, is there anybody in the room that doesn't know what a third place is? Okay, a couple of people. Well, basically what they are, there's home and there's work, and then the third place is kind of like the old Cheers slogan of, what was it, where everybody knows your name or whatever. It's the place you go and hang out with your friends, and the waiter, the chef, and everybody knows you, and so there ought to be those in a neighborhood as well. Another thing, especially when we're talking about getting smaller units, because everything shouldn't be McMansions, another thing is that every neighborhood should have a bed and breakfast, because if you think about it, prior to the meltdown, a typical guest suite in an American home was somewhere in the vicinity of 250 square feet, but then by the time you got the bedroom and the bathroom, and they'd all graduated to walk-in closets by then, right before the meltdown. And so 250 feet at $200 a foot is $50,000 that you're paying mortgage payments on every month of the mortgage. And if you alleviate that burden from people, where they can simply send their guests down to the B&B, a couple blocks down, the guests would probably appreciate it, and then they wouldn't be just under your roof as well. You both have a little bit of privacy that way, I guess I should say. And then the next step is to get a variety of housing types that you hadn't thought of, especially including the smaller cottages. There's so many towns that, you can't build less than a 1,500 or 2,000 square foot single-family home. We ought to be able to do single-family homes as small as we can, so long as the character and quality is kept up. That's what will drive the value down, is if you put up a shack, not if you put up a jewel box. You know, if you build it, you can build an incredibly delightful, elegant little jewel box of a house that might be only 300 square feet, and everyone will love it. And it'll drive property values up. So it's not the size, it is the character that drives property values one way or the other. We also need to think about a broader range of housing types. This is the coastal living idea house that Wanda and I designed in Norfolk in 2011. And this house was actually designed to start off without the master wing. And so there's a master bedroom upstairs and then a children's realm. It's an open room with bed alcoves that the kids, curtained alcoves that the kids sleep in. And so eventually at some point, you know, early on you want to have your kids around you. At some point in time, once they reach their teen years, they don't want you around. You probably don't want to have them so close either. And so then at that point, you can build on the master bedroom wing downstairs and let the oldest kid have your old bedroom. And then, of course, at some point in time, about the time the kids all leave and go to college or whatever it is they're doing, then probably one of your parents needs to move in with you. You move back upstairs to the upstairs master. They move in down to the downstairs master. And then at some point in time they pass on, you can move back down, but by that time you got boomerang kids that come back, and so they have the whole upstairs suite with their family. At some point in time you pass on, and the whole cycle continues. And so the idea is that this is a home that can stay in the family for years. So we need to think of a lot of other types like that people aren't even considering today for how that we actually live. It shouldn't be just the 2,400 square foot, 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath. You know, we all know that drill. And people say, well, that's what the biggest chunk of the market wants. That's true. That chunk of the market is about 23% of the American housing market. Unfortunately, that's all we built pretty much since the end of World War II is what they call the sweet spot house, leaving every other piece of the market, the other 78, 77%, hideously underserved. When you start doing houses for these other parts of the market, when you may have 50 houses and there's 2,000 people in the region that would be greatly served by that, that's what you call a bidding war. Okay? I mean, it really does work that way. Matter of fact, I'm showing some examples of a place that I worked on years ago in Alabama, and this is prior to putting. I've been begging these people. I said, please let me put some rear lane carriage houses in where you park underneath and you live above. And they finally let me put a couple of them in the plan. They don't even show up here, and they sold so quickly. They said, you got to put more in the plan. So anyhow, I came into some of these rambles on the interiors of the blocks. And put some more in, and they just all sold out immediately, right up until the meltdown, at which point then they weren't really, I mean, nobody could get a mortgage for anything after that. But the point is these types that are hideously underserved will be the quickest sellers without any shadow of a doubt. Step 9 is to start building live-work units. Now, the classic live-work is like this, where you live above the shop, but there's a lot of other types as well. Here's one where the work is in front of an apartment building frontage. So originally that was an apartment building. I don't know if these shops were built originally or later. Here's a place where definitely the Starbucks was added later on in front of the row house frontage. Here's a case where a restaurant was added in front of a single-family home frontage. And then here's one called a work behind, this workshop behind that house, where somebody could go into all sorts of craft endeavors. This is the work nearby. Now, I don't know for a fact that that person actually lives there and works here, but they could. You know, so it's a so that's the idea there. Now, what I mentioned earlier in the sky method, I was showing you about the idea of these very slow little accretions at the beginning. Here's a house here that has a little shop here that they've added on, and a little office here that they've added on. Tiny little, just darling buildings. As a matter of fact, I'm gonna drop the P-bomb on you. You know, you normally worry about the F-bomb. Well, this is the P-bomb, and it's a term that architects. Actually, I'll drop the C-bomb on you. How about that? Either one. But either one, regular people understand exactly what I mean. Architects just cringe when I mention the word. It's either precious or charming. You know. I mean, architects need some kind of an ejection after hearing those terms. But anyhow, that's what those small scale things are. Nobody ever goes, there's no customers that come in, they just work on the first level and live above. And then at this point, you need to be talking about neighborhood markets, and those can be very small. If you have enough walk appeal and enough customers, then you can actually have tiny little markets like what they have in Europe that just have just the basic commodities, and that's it. At this point in time, you're ready to talk about dedicated office and retail. This should begin with a single crew workplace. I don't know how many people know Mike and Patty's in Boston, but this is Mike and that's Patty. Mike serves and Patty cooks, and they have a place that is rated the best sandwich shop in Boston on about 200 square feet. I mean, I think there's like 7 or 8 seats in there if you can get one of them because they're in such high demand. And then another thing about tiny shops, if you just look at the architecture of this building, there's nothing charming about that at all. Okay, but the fact that it is so tiny actually gives it a bit of charm that it wouldn't have if it were 3 times as large. You know, if you just look at the details are not good at all. There's home conversions that we need to be able to do. Then there's also incubators. And actually, let's talk about starting out small. Robert Orr, is Robert still here? Well, anyhow, whether he is or not, this is his office in New Haven, and he actually had leased out the front for a yoga studio, as you can see, and then actually had another part of it that he's doing as an incubator space where you can come in and office by the hour or by the day. The next step up would be retail shanties that are very ephemeral. As a matter of fact, if these all blew away, it wouldn't be a big deal because each one of them is only a few $100s worth of material, and that's it. And so the idea is it's cheap enough to remove painlessly. The problem is these are so lovable. This is perspicacity at Seaside that now people aren't letting them take them out, even after they've been there 20 years. They're long past due. And then business cottages and lighter buildings, which are again highly portable. And then you have movable stores that might be a 2-story building that nonetheless is designed to go elsewhere. And then finally graduating to a 3 to 5-story masonry town center. Last is civic buildings. That you would probably last on the list, and they can be very simple. This is nothing but a bunch of gang mailboxes for a neighborhood, but this put into a proper civic enclosure. This was when we first got this job. The developer asked me. He said, "What are you going to do about all that? Where are you going to spoil all that dirt?" I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Are you talking about the hill over there?" He said, "Yeah, the previous people we were talking to said we needed to get rid of all that dirt, so flatten it out, we can get lots." I said, no. Leave the hill, put a chapel on the hill, line a street up with it, it'll be the money shot for the neighborhood. And so that's what we did. But I should say, this is a wedding chapel, and it makes its money off of being a wedding chapel. In other words, it is built on the pro forma of having weddings there. So there's all sorts of ways of making this work. I'm 22 seconds over. Thank you all very much.